He was half staggering, half crawling up the beach, and he looked a mess. His hair was bleached and even falling out in places. His skin was wide and blotchy, scarred, his clothes destroyed. What could have done this to him? And the smell? It was stomach turning, a combination of stale fish and vomit. And Jonah was almost unrecognizable from the man that he used to be. It turned out he'd been through the most dramatic and traumatic of events. It must have felt like a lifetime ago when God had first called Jonah to go to the city of Nineveh. But back then Jonah had other ideas. He simply didn't like the people. He didn't want to go there. So he jumped into a boat and went in completely the opposite direction. But God had other plans for Jonah. It took a violent storm that threatened to sink the boat and kill everyone in it. A death swim that meant that he almost ended up in a watery grave, but instead he was swallowed by a big fish. Jonah is as good as dead, floating in the bottom of the ocean. But it's from this place of complete helplessness that he calls out to God, and 3 days later he is miraculously puked up onto a beach. Messy, yes. Sticky, yes. Smelly, oh yes. And now, as Jonah comes staggering up that beach, he knows that God has given life back to one repentant sinner. He knows that God has not given up on him. In fact, God is still speaking to him again. But this time things are different. God has got Jonah's attention, and as he speaks to Jonah a second time, he repeats the same thing. Go to Nineveh, with one difference. This time God is not going to take no for an answer. Because from inside that fish, Jonah has made a promise with God. He's promised to obey. Jonah is able to get up. Jonah is able to keep going because he knows that God has forgiven him. Knowing God's forgiveness is a powerful thing. He removes sin, he removes guilt and shame. He brings restoration. He provides hope for our futures. It was Jonah who had experienced all of this. And it's a reminder to all of us that God does not give up on anyone. Jonah eventually arrives at this important city of Nineveh. It's a significant city because, well, it's a major trade route. It's also about 4 times bigger than any of the surrounding cities. But the people who lived there are called the Assyrians. And this group of people had opposed Israel for years. They were the enemies of Israel, and for that reason, they were also enemies of Jonah. He doesn't want to be there. He doesn't really want to be speaking to these people, and running away for him is not an option anymore. And anyway, he must be thinking, what difference can one man really make? So Jonah reluctantly walks through the city for one day. He says nothing. His hair's bleached, skin's damaged. He must have been noticed by the people, and yet at the same time the smell must have stopped people from coming close to him. He knew he was going to have to speak at some time. He couldn't be quiet forever. And when he eventually does speak to the people, it's probably the worst sermon that's ever been preached. He sort of whispers, mumbles, 40 days and your city will be overthrown. Because deep down, Jonah doesn't want this city to survive. He wants it destroyed. But God cares for the people of Nineveh, and God hasn't given up on them. And he uses Jonah's reluctant whisper. But he also uses the king. The king was someone who, up to that moment, hadn't even believed in God. But when the king speaks, the people take notice. And everyone from the oldest to the youngest, from the wise to the foolish, they don't eat, they don't drink, There is genuine mourning and repentance. Even the animals are not eating or drinking. Such is the manifest presence of God. And God in his mercy, God in his grace forgives them. And you can't help but see how much God cares. And that no one is beyond the reach of God's salvation. In one day, 120,000 people drop to their knees in brokenness and repentance before God. This is a community that is saturated with God's presence, and perhaps it's the greatest revival in history. And it's a reminder to each of us again that no one is beyond the reach of God's salvation. Do you know, God still cares for individuals. God still cares for nations today, and he does not give up on his people. There have been many times down through the centuries when God has broken into communities in equally powerful ways. It happened in a small Hebridean island off the coast of Scotland in the 1950s. Before the revival, the church was almost emptied. Many of them were about to close their doors. But there were a few people who knew that God does not give up on his people. So they began to meet in small groups to pray. Some of them were meeting in their homes, others were meeting in barns. I guess a step up from the belly of a fish. Nevertheless, God still uses the most unlikely people who believe enough to pray. There were two sisters, Peggy, who was blind, and her sister Christine, who was riddled with arthritis. And although they were too disabled to attend church, they prayed in their home. And God saw the passion that they had for his glory, and so he met with them and he honoured their faith in him. It was through their prayers that God came down in such a powerful presence upon that Hebridean island. Others were meeting 3 times every week, sometimes till 4, even 5 o'clock in the morning. One night, the local blacksmith was called upon to pray, and as he prayed, the power of God was released. It rattled the dishes on the dresser, and then just this waves of divine presence just moved across the room. Simultaneously, the Spirit of God swept through villages. People were not sleeping. They were walking the streets in convictions. Others were kneeling by their bedsides to pray, asking God for pardon. People were turning to God at all hours of the day and night, calling on God to save them. Some of them were in their fishing boats, others in the fields. Sinners broke down and cried out for mercy without hearing a single word from even a preacher. Churches were holding 4 services on a Sunday evening: 7 p.m, 10 p.m, midnight, and 3 a.m. Such was the hunger for God. Often the churches were packed to the doors with many more people waiting outside. Within 48 hours, the pubs were closed. Many young people had surrendered their life to Jesus and were found in the prayer meetings. In some districts, there was hardly a person who was not affected by the revival. One lad fell to his knees by a pigsty and just was wonderfully saved. Not long after, a search party was sent out to find him because he's late coming home from the fields. They found him face down in the heather, repeating over and over, "Oh Jesus, I love you, I love you, Jesus, oh Jesus, I love you, Jesus." And when he was asked to pray in a particularly difficult service, just 3 sentences of prayer brought forth fire from heaven. The preacher Duncan Campbell said that more souls were saved through young Dolan's prayers than through all of the preaching of all of the preachers in the revival. Crime ceased. The police station was left unused, and virtually every person in Lewis and Harris was saved during that 3-year revival. You can see why Duncan Campbell said, "A revival is a community that is saturated with God." The story of Jonah, the stories of subsequent revivals remind us that God does not give up on anyone. And he can use the most unlikely people, and no one is beyond the reach of God's salvation, and that includes you. It includes me. A number of years ago, I was working in Belfast, and I worked with a group of people who loved to party, and from time to time I would go out with them. I didn't drink alcohol, so they quite liked this because it meant I became the designated driver. And they were a lively bunch, but there's one particular lady who was the life and the soul of the party. I kept praying for her and for others and gently talking and responding to questions about Jesus. And she listened. But about a year later, she walks into work and she announces in front of everyone that she has become a Christian. And she just radiates just the presence of Jesus. In fact, the change and her testimony was so obvious, was so dramatic, that it made a massive impact on her family, on her friends. Her daughter, her son-in-law became a Christian. Another receptionist became a Christian. One of our co-workers rededicated her life to Jesus. But my favourite part of the story is about a girl called Deirdre. And she was just watching everything that God was doing. A few weeks went past and she started coming along to the discipleship group that we had begun in work. And she asked lots of questions, and eventually she came to me one day and said to me, "How do I become a Christian?" I said to her, "It's as simple as A, B, C. A, admit that you need help. Admit that you've done wrong. Admit that you are a sinner. B, believe that Jesus is the answer, that he is the one who died for your sin, who died in your place, that he is the one who rose again from the dead, and that by faith in him, he can change you." And then C, come to him. Turn from your sin, turn from your pride, and follow him. Follow Jesus. And then she asked me another question. And she said, "But how will I know?" I thought for a moment, and I simply said to her, "When you ask him, he will reveal himself to you." I would normally pray for someone there and then, but it was a busy office, so I encouraged her to go home that evening, and I give her a little booklet with a prayer to pray. I got a phone call about 9 p.m. that evening. It was Deirdre. And she was half laughing, she's half crying, and all she says to me is this: "I know. I know." And in that bedroom that evening, she met with Jesus, and he performed a deep work of grace within her life. He changed her. He saved her. And what God did for Deirdre, he can do for you as well, through Jesus Christ. Call out to him. Remember that God never gives up on you, and that no one is beyond the reach of God's salvation, and that includes you.